Hello chess friends! For those of you who have been closely following Magnus Carlsen and his recent behavior, what I am about to show you will probably not come as much of a surprise. But if you only check in on Carlsen now and then what you're about to see might just leave you feeling a bit confused, disturbed, and wondering, how could a world champion of chess behave in such a way? It all began as a normal-looking queen's pawn opening, Carlsen playing white here in Title Tuesday on chess.com against the Norwegian Super Grandmaster Arian Tari, who has a blitz rating of nearly 3,000, and who responded with knight to f6. After which Carlsen, without any warning, decided to play the fourth worst move that white could possibly play in this position. He played the very bizarre, very rare, and highly inappropriate pawn advance. He played g4, giving up a pawn for no good reason. The only moves worse than this for white in this position are bishop to h6, e4, and king to d2. Tari responded with the best move. He simply took the pawn. And although I said Carlsen has given up a pawn for no good reason, it's not without any reason at all. This gambit does allow him to immediately grab his big pawn center with the move e4, since the knight has been lured away from the f6 square, from which it could capture the pawn on e4, and this comes with an attack on the knight. So what do you do about this as black? Well, you got a couple options here. The best thing for black to do is to simply defend the knight with the move d6, or you can even play d5, giving white the opportunity to go into what resembles a Scandinavian defense if he were to play e takes d5, which is not a good move because of the fact that when queen takes d5 is played, it comes with an attack on the rook. So there's no time to kick that queen around with the move knight to c3, which is what you normally do in the Scandinavian defense. But instead of this, Tari goes for an inferior line. He plays knight to f6, which allows e5, kicking the knight to d5, and after c4, we get what resembles Alekhine's defense after the move knight to b6, with a couple of key differences from the normal variation of Alekhine's defense. That is, the g-pawn is gone, so black does have an extra pawn, and it's white's turn to move in this position. Normally it would be black's turn to move, but black has wasted two moves by moving his knight to g4 and then back to f6. White had only wasted one move with the pawn g4. That's why white is up a tempo here. So while this position does still favor black having the extra pawn, white does have some compensation, which Carlsen promptly throws away. He should play the move knight to c3, something like that, just supporting his center. He should leave the pawns where they're at, but he pushes with c5, getting aggressive, which of course opens up a big hole on d5, which Tari gladly jumps into with his knight. Carlsen proceeds to attack the knight with bishop to c4. It's defended. He increases the pressure with knight to c3, but Tari does not need to leave his knight in the center. He can take on c3. And after b takes c3, he plays d6. He's playing well. Wants to break up Carlsen's aggressive pawn structure. We have knight to f3, d takes c5, grabbing another pawn, which Carlsen is not going to want to recapture. If white were to play d takes c5, queen takes d1, king takes d1, and look at this horrible pawn structure. The c5 pawn is about to fall, so of course Carlsen's not going to go down that road. He develops a rook to the open file, and now knight to c6 from Tari. Just increasing the pressure on d4, that's his plan now. But Carlsen still has some tricks up his sleeve. He plays bishop to g5, hitting the queen. What do you do about this as black? Well, the best move here is to play bishop to e7 and give back the pawn. After bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, white gets to grab on g7, but black can take on d4, and there's a nice little trick here. White can never recapture with the pawn, or there's going to be queen to b4 check, picking up a free bishop, unless you defend with the knight, which will lose the d-pawn. So white would have to take with the knight, and after knight takes, we got to take with the queen. Black can play bishop d7, get ready to castle. And the engine says this is roughly equal. Despite white's horrible pawn structure here, he does have a lot of activity with his pieces, but black's okay because he's about to castle queenside. But for whatever reason, Tari didn't like that. He wanted to avoid giving the pawn back by playing queen to d7, getting out of the way of the bishop, but sort of awkwardly blocking the activity of his light-squared bishop. And what do you do here as white? Well, if you're Carlsen, you play queen to e2. taking protection off the pawn, but setting up one of the oldest tricks in the book. If black were to now take on d4, you're not going to recapture and lose a pawn. You're going to throw in this rook to d1 move, pinning the pawn to the queen, and white's going to get that pawn back. So Tari, apparently aware of that, doesn't take the pawn. He decides to play knight to a5, attacking the bishop. But this is not the best move for black. What black needs to do in this position is play h6. And if the bishop drops back to h4, you're going to play g5. You're not going to let this bishop stay on this diagonal. You'll see why this is important in a minute. But after knight to a5, Carlsen sees an opportunity. He's not worried about the knight capturing the bishop. He decides to open the file with d takes c5. Tari grabs the bishop, but Carlsen's not interested in recapturing because he's got rook to d1, attacking the queen. And where's that queen going? You better not go very far, because if that rook gets to d8, that's checkmate, my friends. So what do you do here as black? The best move is to actually just put the knight in the way, give the piece back, and white is better, but black may be able to survive this. But Tari decides to keep the extra piece here and give up the queen for a rook. After king takes d1, he defends the knight. Black now has a minor piece and a rook for his queen, and the extra pawn, which in some situations might be sufficient, but not in this one. Carlsen has too much activity, and he goes to work right away with queen to e4, hitting the rook. Okay, it goes to b8, and now knight to d4. The threat here is to take the pawn on b5, followed by taking the knight on c4. So we got bishop to b7, attacking the queen, c6. Hitting the bishop, it goes to a6. A pretty miserable square for that bishop, unless black has a chance to get in the move b4. Carlsen now proceeds with knight to b3. Not sure what his exact plan is at this point. The computer says white is threatening queen to d4, which would hit this pawn on a7. It'd threaten to come in here to d7. Maybe that's what Carlsen's seeing. And now Tari decides to kick that bishop off the diagonal. h6, bishop to e3. He tries to get active with b4, looking to open the file, try to make something happen with his rook. But Carlsen now proceeds with bishop to c5, which looks pretty reasonable. You wouldn't think this is a blunder, but this actually completely throws away white's winning advantage. Carlsen's idea here, of course, is to trade off the bishops. Then he can post the knight on c5 unopposed, where it's going to be eyeing a whole bunch of juicy squares. But this move gives Tari the opportunity to equalize, starting with knight to b2 check, which he doesn't find. But this is surprisingly hard for white to deal with. Where are you putting your king? If you go to c1, then there's going to be knight d3 check, picking up the bishop. If you go to c2, there's going to be bishop to d3, protected by the knight, picking up the queen. So the engine says the best move here would be king to d2, but this allows the rook into the action with check. Rook d8, the bishop should block. And now bishop d3 hitting the queen, queen f3, bishop f5. And apparently black has enough activity now to survive, according to the engine. A nice demonstration of why you'll never beat Stockfish. But Carlsen is not playing Stockfish. He's playing a human who misses knight b2 check. Tari instead goes for rook to d8, allowing Carlsen's king to safely move to c1, stopping any knight b2. And now Tari grabs the pawn on c3. But here we go. Carlsen executes his idea. Bishop takes f8, king takes, and now the knight drops into c5. Hitting the bishop, eyeing the beautiful d7 square, eyeing e6, where there could be a potential sacrifice. It's all very nasty. Tari plays knight to d2, attacking the queen. And you got to be very careful with these counter threats, because if that queen can go somewhere very dangerous, you're in big trouble. The bishop's still hit. And Carlsen does have a devastating move with his queen. He goes to b4, setting up a very nasty discovered check. Now what Tari needs to do here, I mean, it doesn't really matter. He's going to lose. Black is totally busted here. But he should get his king out of danger with something like king to g8. But then he just loses his bishop. So he tries bishop to e2. But this sets up a checkmate in 2 moves, which Carlsen does not miss. See if you can find it. Take a minute. How does white checkmate in 2 moves? The move played by Carlsen here is knight takes e6, double discovered check. So the king has to move. You got a couple options. You can play king g8, allowing rook takes g7, which is checkmate. Or you can play what Tari played in the game, king to e8, and after Carlsen's knight takes g7, that is checkmate. So there it is, my friends. Magnus Carlsen checkmating Norway's strongest grandmaster, besides himself, in only 28 moves by playing a bad opening. How does he do it? How are these incredibly strong players unable to punish his terrible, inappropriate opening play? I don't know. Carlsen just knows how to lure them into a convoluted mess of a position that only he can seem to properly navigate. So thanks for watching, consider subscribing, and I'll see you on the next video.